The small-town boy with big dreams. James Madison lived in a town where time seemed to have stopped. The streets, once busy with the hum of factories, now sat silent, covered in the dust of forgotten promise. His house was tucked away at the edge of this decaying world, a small, worn-down building with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. Inside, it smelled faintly of old books and the sharp tang of his mother's perfume, a scent she wore for the few moments she could escape the diner where she worked. James had always been different. While other kids played on the crumbling sidewalks or spent their afternoons at the park, James buried his head in books. They weren't just any books, either. He had an obsession with history, with politics, with words that had once shaped nations. He read about the founding fathers, and although he was far from a founding family himself, he felt an unexplainable connection to them. He dreamed of change, of a world beyond the walls of his town. His mother often caught him staring out the window, the weight of his ambition visible in his young eyes. "James, you can be anything you want," she'd tell him, but there was always an unspoken sadness in her voice. She believed in him, but the town was a cage. There was no escape. Not unless you had something to give that others wanted. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across their small front yard, James' grandfather sat beside him on the old wooden porch swing. His grandfather's hands trembled as he adjusted his worn glasses, the remnants of a once proud war veteran now reduced to a frail man of few words. But when he spoke, his words carried weight. "James," he said softly, "the world won't give you anything. You'll have to take it. You've got to be ready to fight for it." James listened, as he always did. His grandfather's stories were filled with pride and resilience, stories of men who stood tall even when the world pressed them down. Those stories, however, were of a time long past, a time that felt far away from the small town where James felt stuck. The next day, as the school bus rumbled through the streets, James clutched a letter that had come that morning. The seal was unfamiliar. It was from a prestigious university in Washington, D.C. His heart pounded in his chest as he tore it open, scanning the words with disbelief. A full scholarship. To the very place he had dreamed of but never thought possible. The town, the life he had known, all seemed suddenly distant, like a shadow of a life he had to leave behind. That night, as his mother cooked dinner, she looked at him with a mixture of hope and worry. "This is it, James. This is your chance." James held the letter close to his chest, feeling the weight of it. The world had just opened up to him. And yet, as he looked out the window at the town that had shaped him, he knew that this was only the beginning. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was the only one that mattered. And for the first time, James Madison felt the stirrings of something deeper within him, a fire that would carry him forward, no matter the cost. A new world, a hidden battle. James had never imagined that the bright lights of Washington, D.C. would feel so cold. The moment he stepped off the bus, the city felt like a beast, a living, breathing entity, pulsing with energy, yet indifferent to his existence. The air was sharp, the streets crowded with people who seemed to move with purpose, their eyes never meeting his. He had arrived at the prestigious university, but it felt less like a gateway to his future and more like a prison of expectations. His dorm room was small, a far cry from the spacious home he had imagined for himself. The walls were bare, save for a few academic posters and a map of the city. The city that, in all its grandeur, now felt overwhelmingly foreign. James' classmates spoke of vacations in exotic places, their families members of the elite who made the headlines, their last names recognizable on every corner. He, on the other hand, was an unknown. A boy from nowhere, trying to fit into a world where nobody cared to know his story. The first few days were a blur. James attended lectures, took notes, but couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. The professors, though kind, seemed to look past him, as though his presence was more an obligation than a privilege. In the dining hall, he found himself surrounded by conversation that danced over his head, talks about investment portfolios, prestigious internships, and career paths that led to power and influence. James felt the sting of his own inadequacy. Then, there was Professor Harris. A tall, middle-aged man with a sharp gaze and a reputation for being an intellectual giant. He was the kind of professor students either revered or feared. When James handed in his first essay, a critique of American foreign policy, Professor Harris seemed intrigued. He lingered after class, eyes studying James as if searching for something deeper. "You have a way with words," Harris remarked, his voice cold but approving. "But you lack the experience to truly understand the power of those words. Keep writing, but remember, the world doesn't care about ideas, it cares about execution." James left the meeting feeling both validated and unsettled. Professor Harris had seen something in him, but it was clear that intellectual prowess alone wouldn't be enough. In this world, where doors were closed to those without the right connections, James needed more than just ideas. He needed to be like them, polished, confident, and, above all, connected. But James wasn't ready to become like them. He couldn't, his roots were too deeply embedded in a world that had always told him he wasn't enough. The first night after his meeting with Harris, James sat in his room, staring at the letter of acceptance that had brought him here. He realized that the real challenge wouldn't be the work. It would be the fight to preserve the person he had always been in a place that seemed determined to erase it. As he turned out the lights and lay in bed, the weight of his dreams pressed down on him. He could already feel the transformation starting. The questions lingered: should he stay true to himself, or would he have to bend to fit in? And if he bent, would he ever stand tall again? Truth is a fire. James couldn't remember the exact moment when his quiet discontent had shifted into something more dangerous. It was a gradual thing, the way a flame grows unnoticed until it consumes everything in its path. The anonymity he had once sought in the crowded halls of the university now felt suffocating. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, taking root in the late-night hours when the rest of the campus slept, and he sat alone, writing. His essays became sharper, more pointed, critiques not just of politics, but of the very system that had allowed him to rise only to trap him in the same mold it had shaped others. His writing took on a new urgency. With each word, he tore apart the facade of meritocracy that had been sold to him since he was a child. The system, he wrote, was rigged, and it wasn't just the political elite that was responsible. It was the entire apparatus, the universities, the corporations, the networks of privilege that hid behind their polished facades, pretending to offer opportunity to those who had none, while pulling the rug from under them once they were too high to climb down. One night, James submitted an essay under a pseudonym to a prestigious academic journal. He thought it would go unnoticed, just another anonymous submission lost in the shuffle of academia. But instead, it ignited a firestorm. The piece was bold, undeniable in its truth. It called out the hidden forces manipulating the so-called rising stars in political and economic spheres, and within days, it went viral. Social media exploded with debates, both in support and in opposition. Some cheered him on, calling him the voice of the forgotten, others dismissed him as an angry, misguided idealist. The university, once an institution of knowledge, now felt like a courtroom. Professors whispered behind closed doors, and James found himself the subject of hushed conversations wherever he went. One afternoon, as he passed the faculty lounge, he overheard a professor speaking to another. Someone needs to teach him a lesson. He's not ready for the world he's criticizing. When James entered his next class, Professor Harris was waiting. The man's usually composed demeanor had cracked, his expression tight with unspoken tension. "James," he said, his voice low, "I've read your essay. I respect your passion, but you're playing a dangerous game. This isn't the time or place for such reckless ideas." James didn't flinch. He had heard the same kind of warnings before. He knew that this was what they all feared, that someone might dare to expose the truth of what they all protected. "I'm not playing," he replied, his voice steady, "I'm speaking." The confrontation that followed was inevitable. The university demanded an apology, or else face expulsion. James was given a choice: bow down to the pressure or stand his ground and risk everything. But to James, the decision was clear. He had come here to learn, to grow, but above all, to make a difference. He couldn't return to the shadows now. His words had already set something in motion. The day before the hearing, James walked through the campus, feeling the weight of his choice settle on his shoulders. For the first time, he wasn't running from anything. He wasn't afraid of what might happen. If this was the price of truth, then so be it. A voice beyond the walls. Months passed since James had stood in front of that university courtroom, his words still echoing in the minds of many. He had been expelled, just as they had threatened, but he didn't leave Washington, D.C. in defeat. Instead, he returned to the small town he had left behind, but it wasn't the same place anymore. The silence of the streets didn't feel as suffocating as before. Now, it seemed like the calm before a storm. James moved into a modest apartment above a cafe at the edge of town, a far cry from the campus he had once called home. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do now. He had lost his place in the world that had once promised him a future. But instead of retreating into despair, he poured himself into writing. His ideas, which had once been confined to the pages of journals and classrooms, now had a new platform, his voice. He wrote essays, stories, and reflections that pierced at the heart of what he had experienced. Months of rejection turned into months of success. His words, now powerful and unyielding, found their way into the hands of people who, like him, had been left behind. The book he eventually published, The Silent Majority, was an honest, raw account of his rise and fall, his journey from a small town to the heights of political academia, and his eventual dissolution.